Welcome back. Our next guest book, Therapy Isn't Just for White People, is an illuminating memoir from attorney and author Kiara Imani. Now, within the book, Kiara shares her journey to understand the racial trauma experienced by many Black people in America and the underlying effect it has on Black mental health. It's my great pleasure to welcome Kiara to Inside South Florida. Good morning.
Of course, thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to have you on the show. Your book, Therapy Isn't Just for White People, a memoir. Such a compelling read. When I flipped through the pages and started reading the entries and the passages and the short stories and the essays, I could relate to a lot of what you're talking about in this book. But for our audience, take us through the journey of arriving at this memoir.
Yeah, so I've always been a writer. I assumed that I would start with fiction. That was always my goal. But as I sat down and started to character map and think through some of the characters from my fiction stories, and you have to really get into their backgrounds and their experiences and their traumas, I naturally started to think about my own. And I ended up writing about my own story. I became the main character of my own book. And I'm so glad you started with saying it felt relatable, because I felt growing up, I just didn't read literature where I felt seen and heard. And I really wanted to speak to the experience of a lot of African Americans here in the US.
Outside of literature, Kiara, I could imagine that you probably didn't see seen and heard in a myriad of different spaces growing up, because there wasn't a lot of places where you could see yourself as a young Black female. You're an attorney, you're a business owner, you're very successful. In the book, you recount your journey of mental health and why, as you said, the traumas that you've experienced shaped your mental health. Talk about that, because the conversation, as you know, of course, around mental health is ever evolving. It's very pervasive in a great way. But for yourself, what was your journey of mental health, and where are you at now in that in your journey with mental health?
So I think it's interesting because I definitely believe we've started to talk more about mental health as a society, but there's still this conversation about who's allowed to struggle, who's allowed to have anxiety, who's allowed to be depressed, and who isn't. And so I really had to learn to give myself permission to feel sad, to feel scared, and to kind of break down the stereotypes, even the strong Black women stereotype, that as a Black woman who can do everything, it doesn't mean that I should have to.
You don't have to jettison your humanity, right? You don't have to exit your humanity. And also there's that notion of toxic positivity that I think since the pandemic, we've been trying to come out on the other side of, because as you just said, and I can imagine people watching at home are feeling the sentiment as well, when you are, I don't want to say privileged, but when you are grateful for the wonderful things that you have in your life, or you've been gifted with incredible talents, you still have a side of yourself that should be shared, that is filled with trauma, that does have pain that you want to heal from. And in the title, Therapy Isn't Just for White People, that's bold. That's a bold title. That in and of itself is a reason to pick up this book, but why that title?
Yeah, and I've gotten some responses too from people, I think, who just have not opened the book or taken time to figure out why I called it Therapy Isn't Just for White People. And it's not a dig at white people, but I think in communities of color, there is this idea for a lot of people that we shouldn't be turning to therapy. There is a distrust of the medical profession in general as it pertains to Black people. And I talk about that in my book. I talk about the Tuskegee experiments where Black men were being experimented on unknowingly. And I think there's also this big faith narrative where it's, you should turn to Jesus, you're too blessed to be stressed. And there's so many other things that we're dealing with as a people. Why would you want to add crazy to that list? What do you mean you need a therapist?
I want to quote you because you had an illuminating interview with Ford, and you said, quote, "I wrote this book with the goal of helping non-Black people empathize with the complexities of racial identity development by inviting them into my personal story." This book is an invitation that you're sending out to people outside of the BIPOC community. Since sending out that invitation, what has that response been?
It's so interesting. I think from a lot of people of color, I struggled with so much of this and I feel so seen. There's this saying that I love, the most powerful words in the world besides I love you are me too, because it brings people together. It's not isolating. If you've ever met someone from your hometown and like we connected over LA and you were like, I used to live there. And I'm like, oh, dope, I live in LA. It's this really exciting moment. So I'm really glad that I'm creating that connection with people of color. And then I think with a lot of white people, I've been really shocked at how emotional people have been reading some of my stories. And I talk about my experiences, going to the doctor and having a doctor really not pay attention to any of my pain, check my chart, see that I was a lawyer, come back and say, well, I guess I got to keep you alive now, huh? And I'm like, well, you should have kept me alive before you knew what my profession was. I talk about how when I was a little kid, my first nickname was Buckwheat and the things that kids used to say to me. And so much of my story I'm so familiar with that the emotion just isn't there anymore. But to see a lot of white people really wrestle with the experiences that people of color are dealing with. And I've had people tell me they've cried and it was hard to finish and they just couldn't believe all of the things that I had been through. And it's so interesting to see myself through their eyes because I see myself as someone who's victorious and been able to come through. And it's kind of a struggle not to see myself as a victim. When they tell me, man, just reading about your life brought me to tears. And I'm like, really? I mean, I think I've done pretty well for myself. But I do believe that a huge part of empathy is just using our imagination. It's being able to pretend that we know what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes. And so I'm really glad that people are feeling like my book is allowing them to use their imagination. A lot of times we think about healing as very linear. And for myself, as someone who's been in therapy, there are certain areas where I'm like, I'm healed. I'm past that. I processed through it. But what I have learned is that healing is not linear. Sometimes there's a trigger and things come back and you think you're over something, but you're not actually over it. So I think even writing this book allowed me to give myself more grace.
Therapy isn't just for white people. A memoir by Kiara Imani. Guys, pick this book up if you can, wherever books are sold. Kiara Imani, it has been so awesome connecting with you this morning on Inside South Florida. Thank you.
Of course. And thank you for having me. You're so easy to talk to.